end the class last time, we had our typical L with our price on the y-axis and our quantity on the x-axis. We found out that our average fixed cost starts out at 100 and goes down exponentially. Doesn't quite touch the bottom of the curve ever, but it gets very close. Why does it get very close? Well, because this gets smaller and smaller and smaller the greater the quantity is, because this equation is just my fixed cost over the quantity. My fixed cost doesn't change, so as this thing gets higher, the average fixed cost gets smaller and smaller, right? Anytime we increase the size of a denominator, the fraction is going to get smaller in terms of size. So that's our average fixed cost. Then we had our average total cost, which is this U shape, starts up around here, does something like this. And we have our marginal cost, which is our Nike swoosh. That's telling us how much an additional unit will be. And that's actually drawn poorly because I need to get it through the very bottom of the average total cost. So by definition, the marginal cost goes through the average total cost at its exact midpoint or bottom point, okay? Not midpoint, bottom point. So it's its lowest point. They're called the nadir, zenith, nadir. There's an astronomical term for that. I can't remember. So then there's one curve that we didn't graph last time, that we had the numbers to, but we didn't graph because we kind of were running out of time. And that one is the average variable cost curve. So there's just a couple things to really talk about when we talk about the average variable cost curve. We don't use it very often. A lot of times we just kind of leave it out. So I didn't draw this the best. Let me try to draw it one more time a little bit better. No, don't convert. I need to get rid of that conversion button since I never use it. So essentially it should be something like this. It honestly should be getting like closer and closer and closer to the average total cost curve. So this average variable cost, right? We know it's just our variable cost divided by our quantity. But the thing that we need to keep in mind, the thing that we need to see in this graph, and hopefully I drew this well enough, is that, I didn't really. So it's good right here, so we'll use this one. So this distance between the average variable cost curve and the average total cost curve is exactly equal to the distance between the average fixed cost curve and the x-axis. So as the average fixed cost curve gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the distance, right? This distance between the average variable curve and the average total cost curve gets smaller and smaller and smaller as well. So why is that? Well, it's really definitional. It's because of the fact that my average total cost is equal to my average variable cost plus my average fixed cost. And so as my average fixed cost goes closer to 0, what's the implication of that? My average total cost is going to be right on top of my average variable cost. So any questions about this? We'll tie in price and kind of those decisions and stuff in chapter 7, so you don't have to worry about that. But understanding these cost curves is really important because there's going to be one variation or another that we're going to do for 4 chapters because we're going to be looking at the 4 different types of markets and how you operate a business within each one of those types of markets. So this is our short run stuff. I know it's says long run at the top, but all of this is just review, right? This is our short run production cost review. Any questions on that before we move on? So the big reason why this marginal cost curve, right, is upward sloping is because of that diminishing returns, right? The fact that at a certain point, the size of the pizzeria is fixed. The number of tables, the number of ovens in the pizzeria is fixed, right? And so adding more laborers, trying to sell more, is going to be more and more costly. So let's talk about in the long run now. So the long run is an important concept in economics, but it's kind of difficult for us to get a good handle on it. So the long run. And so in the long run, we know that all production costs are variable. So what does this mean? This means the long run costs, so the things like plant size, and even the industry size can be changed. Depending on market conditions, right? So in order to think about things in the long term, we are going to add up a bunch of short-term production total cost curves, average total cost curves. So what do you mean by that? Well, let's go through an example real quick. So we have our first average total cost of a small plant. It looks like this. Call this our ATC1. And then there's another average total cost curve for a different plant size that's like this. So we call that ATC2. And then there's another for an even larger plant size called ATC3. So at some point, so they're all going down, right? We can notice that they're all getting lower and lower and lower in terms of, you know, where the curve is, right? It's just kind of we're copying, pasting it just lower to the southeast of the original one, right? So this is what's called economies of scale, this portion of it. And we'll talk about what that is in a second. So economies of scale are when you increase the inputs by 2 and you end up with outputs that are greater than 2. So economies of scale essentially say that, you know, things are just going to become cheaper. It's going to become cheaper to make the same amount of things. So we'll talk about the reasons why economies of scale exist in a second. But this economies of scale business is short-lived because our next ATC curve is actually higher than our ATC3, and our final ATC curve, average total cost curve, is going to be even higher still. So this part of the graph we would say is diseconomies of scale. So our long-term average total cost curve ends up being what's called the outer envelope of all of these cost curves. So we just trace the outer bits of all of it as it relates to the x-axis, right? And that becomes our long run average total cost. And so when there's enough of these in between, we don't have these kink points, right? So there's probably some ATC 1.5 that's in between here. And so this, because of a lot of short-term average total cost curve, short-run average total cost curves, this we can approximate by something that is just, and essentially the book has this graph, so I'll replicate it, but it's like if there's just a bunch of them, then those kinks, when we take that outer envelope, are no longer going to be there. So this long-run ATC curve shows the least per unit cost at which any output can be produced. And this is after the firm has had time to make all appropriate adjustments to plant size. So again, why do we have a portion of it that is going down? It's this thing called economies of scale. And then why is it going back up? It's because of diseconomies of scale. So students are often confused, right? Thinking that it's the result of rising resource prices or it's another law of diminishing returns, right? But we're assuming that our resource prices are constant. And secondly, the law of diminishing returns doesn't apply to production in the long run because the law of diminishing returns only deals with situations where a productive resource or input is held constant. So in this case, all of the resources can be changed, and so it can't be the law of diminishing returns. That's the reason why the curve is going down and then back up. So let's talk about why the curve is going down and then back up. So economies and diseconomies of scale. So, economies of scale, or what you might have heard, economies of mass production, expand the downward sloping part of that ATC curve. So as plan size increases, explain, sorry. So some of the reasons for this: labor specialization, if you had to do 5 things and now you only have to do 1 thing, you're going to be way better at doing that 1 thing. You're going to be able to do it faster. And also managerial specialization. So really figuring out, you know, the ins and outs of how do you actually keep track of workers, and, you know, make sure that they're not shirking on the job and watching TikToks when they're supposed to be putting Amazon packages in places or whatever, right? Also, the larger you are, you have a greater ability to purchase and use capital goods more efficiently. So we'll get into some examples of that in a second. The third one, other factors, right? So it might be, you know, there might be extra costs that you don't no longer have, right? So there's startup costs. So startup costs, you know, advertising, design, development, and probably the most costly. I guess we got